Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Visitor, which is episode 2 of season 4 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of Star Trek Week, where I'll be reviewing episodes of Star Trek all week as requested by my viewers. This episode was requested by Heisenberg Compensator 47. The Visitor is the episode that begins where Jake Sisko is a very old man who gets a visit from a huge fan of his novels who wants to know why he stopped writing before he turned 40. So Jake tells her the story that begins with the explanation that his father died. So we flash back to when Jake was 18, which is in present times in the show, where we see Jake take a trip on the Defiant to view some wormhole phenomenon, but something goes wrong, which leads Captain Sisko and Jake to go to engineering, where they apparently solve the problem, but a subspace beam reaches out and apparently kills Captain Sisko. Everyone mourns Captain Sisko's death, but Jake refuses to leave the station even when the political situation with the Klingons gets dangerous. However, Jake starts seeing his father appear and disappear. At first he thought it was a dream, but he soon learns that his father is indeed still alive, but stuck in subspace where he doesn't experience the passage of time. Dax and O'Brien fail to bring him back, and he fades back into subspace again. Eventually, Starfleet relinquishes control of Deep Space Nine to the Klingons, so Jake returns to Earth, certain that he'll never see his father again. So decades pass, where Jake is now in his 30s and married, and Captain Sisko appears once again to Jake, and he's delighted Jake is married and has become a writer. But then Captain Sisko disappears again. After that, Jake deduces that his father is anchored to him, which is why he appears to him no matter where he is. He gives up his writing and studies science in order to find a way to save his father. It becomes an obsession that drives away his wife. He deduced when his father would appear next, so he gets some help from Nog, who's now a captain, as well as Dax and Bashir, and they take the Defiant to the wormhole to try an experiment to save Captain Sisko. The experiment fails, and Benjamin Sisko is upset that Jake is ruining his life and makes him promise to resume his life. Which brings us to the opening narration, where Jake explains to his visitor that he found out when Jake dies, his father will be stuck in subspace forever unless they're together when he dies, in which case he will return to the moment of the accident. She deduces that he's coming there tonight and that Jake is going to kill himself while they're together. Jake gives her an unpublished copy of his new novel and sends her away. Later that night, Captain Sisko returns and is upset at Jake's plan, but Jake insists that this will give them both a second chance. Captain Sisko then finds himself back at the point of the accident and manages to dodge the blast, and when Jake asks if he's alright, he replies by saying, "I am now." So this episode is often cited by many fans as one of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine, if not all of Star Trek, but it's not just the fans. Many involved with the show cited this as their favorite episode, including Avery Brooks and Cirroc Lofton. And I can certainly see why. While I don't consider this my personal favorite, I do think it is one of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine. It is an extremely well-designed, well-paced episode, crafted amazingly well, that is very touching. In fact, I can't think of any other TV episode or movie for that matter that tells a more touching story about a father and son. So first off, I want to talk about the plot device of telling this episode through flashbacks, as old Jake gets a visit from a young writer who wants to find out why he stopped writing, and personally I found this brilliant and extremely effective. In fact, some of the scenes between Melanie and old Jake are some of my favorites of the episode, and some are just as touching as the scenes between Jake and his father. I was amazed at how well this method worked, as typically I'm not a fan of episodes that tell the whole episode through someone telling someone else's story, as it can become really hokey. But not only did it allow them to make giant leaps in time where old Jake informs us what happened in those time periods, but it also sets up an interesting dynamic of old Jake finally getting to tell his story to someone. And the chemistry these two had were amazing, as Jake at this time was very at peace with himself, as he's aware of the plan that he's about to enact. act. The scene at the beginning was amazing, where Jake first meets Melanie and tells her that if she came any other day he would send her on her way, but because she came today of all days, he feels that it's finally right to tell his story. We later learn it's because he knew his father was returning soon and he was going to kill himself. And the ending, where Jake gives her his unpublished book and some parting wisdom that his father gave him earlier about not letting life pass you by, was just such a touching scene, especially knowing what we knew now about how old Jake let his life slip by him and didn't appreciate it. I guess the downer here is knowing that everything he's saying to Melanie will be erased and won't actually happen, because Jake is about to change the past so his father never actually gets trapped in subspace. But oh well, it's still a touching scene. But of course, the crux of this episode and what makes it so touching is the heartfelt story about the love between father and son. There were a lot of great, amazingly well acted, tear-jerking scenes in this episode, but overall every scene worked well to tell the overall very powerful story. It was basically about how Jake let his obsession with his father drive him and basically ruin his life. It was telling when old Jake tells Melanie that typically when one suffers a tragedy like this, they eventually move on and heal. But what made this difference is that Jake knew that his father wasn't really dead, and so the obsession came in where he desperately wanted to save him. But it turned out that saving him was basically an impossibility, and Jake basically threw his life away chasing this obsession. And to be fair, part of the reason he was so driven was due to guilt, as he felt like it was his fault that somehow he abandoned his father. And thus, one of the more touching scenes in this episode is where Jake meets Cisco in the subspace field when they tried the failed experiment to bring him back, and Cisco learns that Jake has basically ruined his life because he was so obsessed with saving him, and this really upsets him, and he'd rather be trapped in subspace forever than to see his son ruin his life. It was just such an amazingly touching scene. And another great scene in this episode comes at the end, where old Jake reveals his plan to kill himself, which naturally Benjamin isn't okay with, as he says, "You shouldn't do this just for me." But Jake explains that it's not just for him, it's also for the boy that he was. So not only will this allow his father to be alive again and never get trapped in subspace, but it will also allow Jake to live a normal life and not let obsession ruin it. So yeah, this was definitely a very powerful ending. Now, whenever there's an episode that uses time travel to set the reset button, as it were, there are always some who will complain as, what does it matter if the events during this episode were just erased? However, in this case, they aren't fully erased, as Benjamin Sisko still remembers them, as you can clearly see at the end of the episode, where he hugs Jake dearly as he realizes the possible future that they just avoided. I hate keep using this word, but it was touching. So it's also great seeing the interaction between the other main characters interacting with Jake and trying to comfort him after his father died. In particular, I love the scene between Jake and Kira, where Kira was pressuring Jake to leave the station as it was no longer safe, but Jake pleaded with her that the station reminded him of his dad too much, and so she let him stay. And that moment that the two of them had together was also very touching. And it's interesting that this scene, although having taken place in a timeline that was erased, was mirrored at the end of the series in the final episode, What You Leave Behind. After Captain Sisko goes off with the wormhole aliens, you see Jake looking out over the wormhole and Kira comforting him, which is a great callback to this episode. Hopefully Jake won't let the obsession with his missing father ruin his life this time around. Hopefully it's a bit different since Sisko left on his own accord this time, but if non-canon novels are any indication, Jake will have a grand old adventure and his father will come back soon. And of course I have to mention the music in this episode that was absolutely on point and totally enhanced the emotional impact of the episode. The quality of the music was recognized as it was featured on the Star Trek 30th anniversary soundtrack, along with the orchestral version of the Inner Light theme. And I agree, this is one of the best examples of a soundtrack in Deep Space Nine. So as with any episode, I did have a few issues with it. In this episode, most of them stem around the whole future storyline with the Klingons being in conflict with Starfleet and them taking over the station. This was at the beginning of the fourth season where they had this unfortunate storyline about Starfleet being in conflict with the Klingons. A storyline I feel was a mistake and one that they would later correct in the very next season and try to sweep it under the rug. So it's a shame that this great episode has to remind me of that failed storyline, and thus many of the depictions of the overall political situations in this future timeline was way off, as many of these things would never come to pass, but oh well. So my rating for The Visitor out of 10 is a 10 the best. I kind of think of this episode as Deep Space Nine's The Inner Light, as it's amazing, touching drama that tells a really personal story rather than a suspenseful or action-packed one. It uses the same dark tone that Deep Space Nine is best at, combining it with the strange time phenomenon that Trek is known for, in order to tell a very powerful tearjerker that perfectly depicts the importance of a son's love for his father, making this one of the best episodes Star Trek has ever produced. So that's it for my review of The Visitor. If there's an episode from any of the 5 Star Trek series you'd like me to review, just leave a comment below with the episode you'd like me to review and I'll endeavor to do so. But please only 1 episode request per person. Also be advised it will be over a month before I can get to any new requests. Be sure to check out the rest of Star Trek Week, as I'll be reviewing episodes of Star Trek all week, as well as many more Star Trek videos to come, as well as many other videos on shows like Game of Thrones and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.